This is the last principal feast that comes in the church year. And it's been celebrated since the ninth century in the worldwide church. So we join in that remembering today as a church. We remember the saints that have gone before us that the church recognizes as great teachers or martyrs or heroes of the faith. Remembering the countless lives of unknown saints who faithfully lived their lives without fame or recognition. So not just the saints we recognize throughout the church year, but also those who we don't know. We also remember the saints in our own lives, right? Those who have gone before us and shaped our lives in profound ways. If you were at the bonfire and storytelling night, you might have heard a few of those stories. But we also take time to acknowledge the pain and the sadness that we carry with losing loved ones in our lives. I know for some of you, the grief of losing loved ones is still very real in your life. In a little while, we'll actually take time to name those people, those loved ones we've lost, and we'll pray for them in our prayers of the people. So whether it is from a place of joy today or a place of pain and grief, I think it's either way, it's good to pause, right? Good to pause and take account and give thanks for these people in our lives. This is one of the great gifts of All Saints' Day, this opportunity to remember, and I'm going to keep pressing into this today, especially as we come up on the final days of this election cycle this week, an election that has profound implications for our future, an election that has many of us, maybe all of us, weighed down with anxiety. I don't know if you're anything like me, but there's a lot of anxiety in my life right now that I'm carrying, thinking about the outcomes of this election. How important is it to remember in times like this, the saints and the martyrs in the early church who, in the threat of empire and persecution in the early church, followed Jesus faithfully as they lived in community with one another. How important it is to remember the saints who, while others were fleeing, went into the towns and cared for the victims during the Black Death. How important it is to remember saints like Catherine of Siena, who became known as the patron saint of women who are too much, for her insistent and courageous calls for reform amongst the male clergy of her day. Would we have more women who are too much in our midst? She proclaimed, this is something she said, be who God made you to be, and you will set the world on fire. And she even called out the Pope at the time, calling for reform. And she's become an inspiration now. Like during the women's suffrage movement, Catherine of Siena was one of the saints that they looked to for inspiration, and she continues to be inspiration for us now. We could go on and on about the saints that have come before us that give us courage and inspiration. And the reason why we celebrate All Saints' Day, besides, of course, the chili cook-off that we're going to have after the service today, is that we need these saints in our memory as we face these anxieties that we carry. We need these saints in our memory. If there was ever a week to be anxious about the future of our country, this is it. And this is why we look back to saints like Bonhoeffer and Romero and others who remind us that we are not alone. On All Saints, we can look back to find inspiration and courage and wisdom needed for our own day. But the interesting thing about today is that we're not just looking back. We're not just looking back on All Saints. If you paid attention to the readings, something really interesting is happening in our readings for today. You might have noticed that they're all looking ahead. They're pointing us not backwards, but forwards. Isn't that interesting that the lectionary readings for All Saints is actually having us look to the future? In our reading from Isaiah 25, if you remember, it casts this vision for the future, promise of Israel. One of the visions that Isaiah reveals is this profound image or a picture of a burial shroud. Now, burial shrouds aren't necessarily used as much anymore, but back then when someone died, their body was wrapped up in a piece of cloth called a burial shroud. It represented death in many ways. And so Isaiah 25 paints this picture of a burial shroud that is cast over all peoples. And the image that comes to mind for me is like in that early morning, the fog that kind of covers over a valley. It just covers over everything. And this represents the reality of death in our world. Humanity is wrapped up in the shroud of death. But the vision that is cast in Isaiah 25 is one of hope. Because on the mountain of the Lord of the on that mountain, the Lord of hosts will destroy the shroud of death. This is the hope against hope that we cling to in our worlds, that the Lord of hosts will swallow up death forever. It's an incredible image, this shroud of death being destroyed, and this image of the Lord of hosts swallowing up death forever. Can you picture that for a second? Forget Harry Potter and the Death Eaters in those stories. Here in Isaiah 25, God is the ultimate Death Eater. The Lord of hosts has consumed death. I know it's a kind of a funny analogy, but that's what comes to mind for me when I think about this image of God swallowing up death. He is the ultimate Death Eater. He has consumed death and taken it into himself and defeated it. Isn't that an amazing picture? Our second reading from the book of Revelation also has us looking forward, pointing ahead to a promised future. In the second to last book of the entire Bible, John's vision in verse 3 says, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, see, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And what does he say? Death will be no more. Like Isaiah 25, once again, we get this promise that death will be no more. On a day when we celebrate the death of all saints, of all those people who have gone before us, we also remember this promise that death will be no more. Both Isaiah and Revelation have us looking into the future on this All Saints' Day. And I want to ask the question, why is that? Why do our readings include these visions that point us forward while we also look backwards? I think it has something to do with something Father Sean shared in his pastoral letter from this past week about the election. If you haven't gotten a chance to read it, I encourage you to do that. It's in our newsletter, and you can find it on social media as well. I think it has something to do with how we hold on to hope in our world today. If you spend time with the saints from past generations, I think you catch a glimpse of this in their lives as well. A lot of the readings that I've read from past saints, I think, cover this ground. Father Sean spoke of a different kind of hope that we have available to us as Christians. It is the kind of hope that is deeply fastened, I think, to these visions in Isaiah 25 and Revelation 21. It is a hope determined by the God who raised Jesus from the dead and is shepherding history toward a future where all things are made right. And so these visions in Isaiah and Revelation aren't static. It's not just like a static vision of a future that we hope for. They're invitations to live into this vision even today. Eugene Peterson once wrote that heaven is not something that we wait for until the rapture or where we go when we die. But heaven is what is, barely out of the range of our senses, but brought to our senses by these visions in Isaiah and Revelation. We are now able to look upon the events around us not as a hopeless morass. This is Eugene Peterson's words. Not as a hopeless morass of human misery, but as the birth pangs of new creation and a beckoning to participate in God's remaking of God's creation. The reason we can have hope at all is because at the heart of our story, we have Jesus, the one who defeated death and rose to new life. We catch a glimpse of this in our gospel reading for this morning, as Courtney shared with us this morning. Here in this incredible account of the raising of Lazarus, we see the beginnings of Isaiah and Revelation being fulfilled. It is a story of deep pain and grief, to be sure. We see Jesus weeping as he enters into the grief of Mary and Martha. And Mary's words to Jesus cut to the heart, don't they? Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. How many of us could see ourselves in those words of Mary? Lord, if you had only been here. Jesus, so moved by Mary's grief, calls out and invites the dead Lazarus to come out of the tomb. Immediately, Lazarus, who has been dead for 4 days, comes to life and walks out. And what does the text say he was still wrapped in? It says his hands, his feet, his face were still wrapped in cloth. Lazarus came out of the tomb still carrying the remnants of his burial shroud. Here in John 11, we see the very beginnings of the work that Jesus will ultimately accomplish in his death and resurrection. And we can put our hope in passages like Isaiah and Revelation precisely because at the center of our story is the one who gave up his very life, who willingly faced death, who willingly went to the depths and swallowed it up, and in rising to again a new life, defeated death. And the words that Jesus spoke in the story of Lazarus, to unbind the burial shroud, are the same words he speaks to us today. He calls us to unbind the burial shrouds that we are carrying. How do you need to hear those words this morning? Where does death still have a hold in your life? Where do you need to let go and come out of the tomb? Jesus calls out to us to leave behind our own burial shrouds and to participate in the work, not just of letting go of the burial shrouds, but about doing the work of unbinding the burial shrouds of others. Like the saints who have gone before us, we are in the business of undoing death in our world. Or as Wendell Berry once put it, we are in the business of practicing resurrection. So on All Saints, we remember to look backwards, to remember all the saints that have gone before us, and we remember to look forward. That's the work set before us today. As we come to the table in a little while, we actually will do this work. And we do this every week, which is one of my favorite parts of our liturgy, as we participate in the mystery of faith, we call it. We'll proclaim at this mystery that's at the heart of the good news of Jesus, that Christ has died, Christ has risen, and Christ will come again. Remember, we do that every week. That's us looking backwards and looking forwards. And so we're going to do that again today on All Saints. And as we look back and we look forward, my prayer is that we would learn to let go of the burial shrouds, the places of death that we are carrying on still in our lives, and walk out of the tomb and lean into the prophetic hope of Jesus in our world today. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.